Out on the wide, wild prairie just outside Helena, Montana, the world looked like it was coming apart at the seams. Lightning forked down from a bruised sky, turning the grasslands silver for an instant, before thunder boomed and rolled across the valley like cannon fire. Rain battered the windshield so hard that Claire Weston's wipers couldn't keep up, and each gust of wind rattled her old Chevy Silverado as if it weighed nothing at all. It was the kind of night when only fools or the lost were out on the road. Claire gripped the steering wheel tighter, blinking away the sting of fatigue and memory. The dash clock blinked 9:17 p.m. She'd been driving for hours, her mind chasing ghosts as the rain chased her. Returning home after more than a decade felt surreal, almost like slipping into a life that wasn't hers anymore. The headlights swept across the sign, Helena, 6 miles. Almost there. Almost home, if home was even the right word anymore. Then, out of nowhere, something dark flickered on the shoulder ahead. Something moving, almost swallowed by the storm. Claire's heart kicked against her ribs. She squinted through the downpour, slowed, and suddenly slammed the brakes, tires screeching on slick blacktop. The truck fishtailed but didn't spin, stopping just short of what she thought was a shadow, but turned out to be a living creature. She threw the truck in park, hazard lights blinking through the sheets of rain. For a second, she just sat there, breathing hard, listening to the storm. Then instinct and curiosity took over. Claire shoved open the door and staggered out into the maelstrom, her boots sinking in mud at the roadside. Standing there, shivering and soaked, was a black horse, big, powerful, and proud even in its misery. Its mane hung in dripping tangles, and every muscle quivered with cold and exhaustion. Rainwater streaked its flanks, mixing with a trickle of blood from a raw wound just above its hind leg. The horse limped a step, nearly stumbling. The sight hit Claire like a punch. The animal was beautiful, battered, and alone, just like she felt inside. She hesitated. This wasn't her world. She'd spent years dodging bullets and bombs as a war photographer, not tending to livestock. Her father's Montana ranch had always been his kingdom, not hers. Still, the urge to help was as fierce as the wind. She took a cautious step closer, heart hammering, hands open and empty. Hey there, it's okay," she called softly, voice barely rising above the wind. The horse jerked its head, ears flat. It tried to back away, but pain and exhaustion kept it rooted in place. And then it did something that stopped Claire cold. It lifted its head and looked straight at her, dark eyes huge and wild and brimming with something she recognized all too well. Fear, hurt, defiance. Something wordless passed between them, sharp and electric. Claire found herself talking as if she could reason with the storm. "Easy, boy. Girl, easy. I'm not going to hurt you. Just, damn, you're in rough shape." She glanced back at the truck, where the horse trailer, borrowed from an old friend, waited empty. For a moment, she thought about calling someone. Animal control, a local rancher, anyone who'd know what to do. But the thought of driving away, leaving this creature to bleed and freeze in the dark, was unbearable. She'd seen too much suffering to walk away from it now, no matter how far from home she felt. She fumbled for her phone and used its flashlight to inspect the wound. It wasn't deep, but it was raw and ugly, probably from barbed wire. She whispered soothing nonsense as the horse snorted and pawed at the mud, rain running in rivers down its face. Lightning split the sky, and for a second, everything was as clear as day. The endless fields, the battered horse, Claire's reflection in its terrified eye. She made her decision. Okay, we're doing this." She hurried back to the truck, grabbed an old blanket and a small first aid kit, and returned to the horse's side. The animal's breathing was ragged, but it didn't bolt. Claire moved slowly, wrapping the blanket over its back and pressing gently on its neck, just like she remembered from her childhood, though her hands trembled. "All right, big guy. Time to get out of the storm. I'm not leaving you here." It took several tense minutes to coax the horse toward the trailer. He resisted at first, nearly pulling her off her feet with a panicked surge, but Claire held on, murmuring, letting the rain wash away her own hesitation. When the horse finally stepped into the trailer, head bowed, Claire felt a jolt of triumph and a deep, heavy responsibility settle on her shoulders. She closed the trailer door, took a deep breath, and stood in the downpour, letting it soak her to the bone. She knew nothing about horses beyond the basics she'd picked up as a girl, and even that knowledge was shaky with age and neglect. But right now, there was no choice. Leaving the horse wasn't an option, not after that look, that moment of silent connection. As she climbed back into the truck and started the engine, Claire glanced into the rearview mirror. The storm raged behind her, thunder following her all the way down the road. In the trailer, the horse shifted and snorted, uncertain but no longer alone. Driving the final stretch to her father's ranch, Claire felt the first flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. Not hope, not yet, but possibility. She didn't know what she was getting herself into, or how she'd care for a wounded, wild animal. But the decision was made, and for the first time in a long time, the fear of the unknown didn't scare her. It felt like a challenge she was finally ready to meet. Outside, the prairie storm began to fade, lightning moving off to the distant mountains. Inside the cab, Claire reached out, touched the old leather photo on her dashboard, a snapshot of her as a girl, standing beside her father and a black stallion, both of them smiling at some lost summer memory. Tonight, as rain traced patterns across the glass, Claire knew life was about to change, and as the battered horse rode out the storm behind her, she realized she was no longer running away from her past. She was driving straight into it. The storm had passed, leaving behind a drenched and muddy silence. When Claire finally turned into the long gravel driveway of her father's ranch, the headlights swept across the sagging fence posts, the ghostly outline of the old barn, and the familiar, lonely porch light burning against the dark. For a split second, she hesitated before cutting the engine. The horse in the trailer kicked at the floor, restless and hurting, as if sensing her uncertainty. She sat for a moment, forehead pressed to the steering wheel, the heater humming softly. How had she ended up here? She'd spent a decade outrunning this place. War zones, refugee camps, bustling cities where her camera had been her only shield. Now she was back, greeted not by family, but by the wild, battered creature she'd dragged from the storm. She shook her head, wiped away a tear she hadn't realized was there, and pushed open the door. Rain dripped from the brim of her hat as she moved to the trailer, every muscle aching from tension and exhaustion. The air was thick with the smell of wet grass, manure, and distant pine trees. The prairie felt bigger than she remembered, emptier too. As she opened the trailer, the black horse stared at her with wide, wary eyes. For a moment, neither of them moved, as if unsure of who should make the first move in this uneasy partnership. "It's okay, buddy. We're home," Claire whispered, the word tasting strange and uncertain on her tongue. The horse hesitated, but, after a few moments, allowed himself to be led, awkwardly, limping, toward the old stable at the edge of the property. Claire flipped the rusty latch, pushing open the heavy door with a grunt. The inside was musty, filled with the ghosts of her childhood. Worn tack, an empty feed bin, a faded rodeo poster pinned crooked on the wall. Everything smelled like dust and memory. She got the horse into a stall and, moving by instinct more than skill, set about making him as comfortable as possible. She found a cracked plastic bucket for water and dumped a generous scoop of feed into the trough. The horse watched her warily, but didn't protest. When she finally had him settled, she sank onto an old hay bale, boots caked in mud, hair plastered to her forehead, hands shaking. What was she supposed to do next? Claire had no idea. She fumbled with her phone, searching for how to treat horse wound, and clicking through shaky YouTube videos under the flickering barn light. She tried to recall her father's old lessons, how he'd handled horses, spoken to them, calmed them down. But the memories felt faded and distant, like photographs bleached by sun. She had almost no medical supplies, just the battered first aid kit from the truck. Gently, she approached the horse. He flinched, ears back, nostrils flaring. Claire moved slow, murmuring nonsense, managing to dab antiseptic around the wound. Wrap it as best she could, with a makeshift bandage torn from an old t-shirt. The horse's muscles twitched, and he gave a warning snort. But he didn't kick. When she finished, she stood there just breathing, letting the tension ebb out of her shoulders. For the first time in ages, she felt the urge to talk, not just to fill the silence, but to confess something that only the night and the animals could understand. "I'm not really good at this," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "I used to think I could handle anything. War, loss, distance. But I don't know if I can handle coming home. Or you, big guy." She looked him over, trying to decide on a name. Ash. The thought arrived suddenly, uninvited, but it stuck. The horse was black as burnt wood, and something in his eyes reminded her of embers, anger and pain, but also the stubborn flicker of survival. She reached out, hesitated, then gently touched his neck. "Ash, that's your name now, if that's all right with you." The horse snorted again, then lowered his head, blowing warm breath into her palm. Claire smiled, surprised at how much it felt like an agreement. The days that followed blurred together, a parade of half-remembered chores and uncertain routines. Claire learned to muck the stalls, measure out feed, and change bandages with trembling hands. She called her father's old friend Marty for advice, and he dropped off some supplies, a salt lick, fresh hay, a battered grooming kit, along with a few words of encouragement. But it was awkward and often frustrating. Ash refused to let her near his back legs, sometimes kicking the stall door or baring his teeth when she came with medicine. He didn't trust her, and Claire couldn't blame him. Every morning, she faced a fresh round of doubts, wondering if she'd bitten off more than she could chew. One afternoon, desperate for answers, she wandered into the farmhouse, digging through old drawers and cabinets. The house was frozen in time. Her father's boots by the door, a half-finished crossword on the kitchen table, the smell of stale coffee lingering in the air. Upstairs, she found a battered photo album stuffed between stacks of bills. She flipped through the pages, family cookouts, rodeo trophies, her own shy smile from a lifetime ago. Then, tucked in the back, she found a photograph that made her freeze. Her father, young and proud in a battered cowboy hat, standing beside a black stallion. The horse in the photo was unmistakable. The same white star on the forehead, the same proud stance as Ash. But the picture was old, 20 years at least. Questions spiraled in Claire's mind. Was it possible? Could Ash be related to her father's horse? Had fate, or something stranger, brought this animal to her out of all the prairies in Montana? Her hands shook as she tucked the photo back into the album, mind buzzing with possibility and dread. That night, She sat beside Ash's stall, moonlight slanting through the warped boards, listening to his breathing. She felt the weight of family history pressing in, the silence between her and her father, the old arguments, the day she left Montana with nothing but her camera and her anger. She'd never forgiven him for his stubbornness, for never understanding why she had to go. She'd never really tried to explain either. Ash neighed sharply, breaking the silence. Claire smiled and whispered, "We both got some baggage, huh?" The prairie was still, stars scattered like diamonds above the barn. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. Claire closed her eyes, thinking about how some stories never really end. They just wait for a chance to begin again. As the wind rattled the windows, she promised herself and Ash that she wouldn't run away this time. Uncertainty and hope tangled inside her, restless and alive. The connection between her and Ash was still raw and uneasy, but it was real. And as she drifted off to sleep beside the horse's stall, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, he'd been sent to help her find her way home. Not just to Montana, but to herself. Morning sunlight stretched across the prairie, painting the fields in gold and warming the dew on the fence posts. For the first time since she'd returned, Claire awoke not to the chaos of storms, but to a peaceful hush. The ranch, though battered by time, felt alive again, a faint pulse beating beneath its weathered skin. Claire rolled out of bed, her body aching from unfamiliar labor. She pulled on her boots and a faded flannel, then paused in front of the mirror. She barely recognized the woman staring back, hair tangled, eyes rimmed with fatigue, but her jaw set with quiet determination. She hadn't felt this kind of purposeful exhaustion in years. War zones had been relentless, but this was different, a marathon instead of a sprint, a slow rebuilding rather than survival. She made her way out to the stable where Ash waited, his dark silhouette just visible through the slats. The horse watched her enter, nostrils flaring, ears pricked forward. There was still wariness in his eyes, but something had softened overnight, a subtle shift she could feel more than see. He no longer looked like he expected her to hurt him. There was a curiosity there now, a flicker of hope. "Morning, Ash," Claire greeted, her voice gentle. She moved slowly, careful not to startle him. She offered him a handful of oats, which he sniffed suspiciously before crunching them from her palm. She couldn't help but grin. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Settling into a routine became Claire's lifeline. Each day she repeated the same gentle rituals, feeding Ash, changing his bandage, mucking out the stall, and brushing his matted mane. She played soft music from her phone and spoke to him about everything she couldn't say to anyone else. Her fears for her father, the heaviness of coming home, the regrets that clung to her like second skin. Sometimes Ash listened, unmoving, with those ancient, thoughtful eyes fixed on her. Other times he'd turn away, flicking his tail in impatience. But as days passed, the sharp edge of his distrust dulled. He'd nudge her shoulder when she came near, and she'd find herself reaching out to stroke his neck, feeling the tense muscles beneath her fingertips begin to relax. One afternoon, as Claire brushed the dust and burrs from Ash's coat, she realized she was humming a lullaby her mother used to sing. The memory washed over her, bittersweet and warm. She closed her eyes, letting herself fall back into the feeling, safety, belonging, the world held together by the simple act of caring for another creature. Ash's wound began to heal under her awkward ministrations. The angry red edges faded to pink, and his limp became less pronounced. He no longer shied away from her touch when she cleaned it. Instead, he stood steady, breathing deeply, his sides moving in slow, measured rhythms. Claire started journaling again in the quiet hours between chores. The habit had saved her in war zones, grounding her when the world spun out of control. She wrote about the ranch and Ash, about the ache of returning and the quiet moments of grace. Watching the sunrise with a cup of bitter coffee, feeling Ash's breath against her cheek, hearing the distant call of a hawk above the prairie. She wrote about her father, too, about the anger and longing she'd never resolved. Some evenings, after she finished tending Ash, she'd sit just outside the stall and read aloud from her journal or a tattered novel she found on the kitchen shelf. Ash would stand nearby, ears twitching at the sound of her voice, sometimes turning his head to watch her with those wise, searching eyes. The stillness of the ranch gave Claire room to breathe and to listen. To Ash, to her own thoughts, to the quiet hum of life returning. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, days when Ash refused to eat, or when his old scars flared up and he'd shy away from her hand. There were nights when loneliness pressed in so tightly Claire thought she'd suffocate. But there were moments of breakthrough too. One morning, as she opened the stall, Ash greeted her with a gentle nudge, his velvet nose brushing her arm. She laughed, surprised at the sudden show of affection, and tears sprang to her eyes. Tears she hadn't let herself cry in years. She buried her face in his mane and let herself feel it all, the grief, the gratitude, the fragile hope. With every day their bond deepened. The routines built trust brick by brick, each gesture of kindness slowly dissolving the fear and suspicion that had taken root in Ash's heart and in hers. He followed her around the paddock as she fixed a broken fence. He whinnied softly when she disappeared into the barn for too long. When she sat in the grass with her back against a sun-warmed rock, he wandered over and stood beside her, content just to share the quiet. One afternoon, a sudden thunderstorm swept in from the mountains. The wind howled, rattling the stable doors, and rain hammered the tin roof. Claire raced outside, heart pounding, memories of that first night flashing through her mind. She found Ash pacing in his stall, eyes wide and anxious, flanks heaving. "It's okay," she whispered, stepping inside. She stood beside him, hand resting on his neck, and began to hum the old lullaby. Gradually, Ash calmed, his breathing slowed, and the panic faded from his eyes. When the storm finally moved on, leaving behind a shimmering world of wet grass and washed clean sky, Claire realized she hadn't felt that kind of peace in years. Each small victory felt hard-won and precious. There was no grand transformation, no instant healing, just the slow, steady work of showing up every day, of letting care and patience bridge the gap between two wounded souls. Late one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple, Claire leaned against the fence and watched Ash graze in the fading light. The silence between them was easy now, filled with unspoken understanding. She thought about how far they'd come, and how far they had yet to go. Healing wasn't a destination. It was a journey, a quiet, everyday miracle. And as the stars blinked awake above the prairie, Claire finally let herself believe that she and Ash could keep moving forward, step by gentle step, into whatever tomorrow held. By the end of the second week, Claire's daily life settled into a rhythm she hadn't known she missed. Morning chores, quiet afternoons with Ash, and long evenings spent at the kitchen table scribbling in her journal. Yet, as peaceful as the ranch could be, there was always a flicker of worry at the back of her mind, an unspoken question about Ash's origins and the trauma etched into the horse's every flinch. The wound on Ash's leg was healing, but Claire couldn't shake the suspicion that there was more beneath the surface. Old injuries, faded scars, the stubborn tension in his muscles whenever he saw unfamiliar people or heard sudden loud noises. That Friday, after a restless night spent worrying over a new patch of swelling, she finally called Dr. Patel, the local vet. Patel had a reputation for kindness and blunt honesty, and after a quick examination in the morning light, her face grew grave. "This horse has seen some things, Claire," Dr. Patel said, running careful hands down Ash's legs. "This is more than a roadside accident. See these scars? Rope burns, bite marks, old sprains. And the temperament. He's not just nervous. He's been mistreated. Probably used for illegal rodeo rings. Maybe even rough handling at an auction." Claire's stomach twisted. "People do that out here?" Patel gave a sad little shrug. "There's always a dark side, even in places that seem quiet. Not everyone treats their animals right. It's a wonder you found him before it was too late." When the vet left, Claire spent a long time leaning against the stall door, staring at Ash as he grazed quietly on fresh hay. The revelation sat heavy on her chest. It was as if she was seeing him for the first time, not just as a lost, frightened animal, but as a survivor, marked by cruelty, yet stubbornly alive. That afternoon, she set about cleaning the tack room, more out of restlessness than necessity. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung in the corners. Sorting through boxes, she found a collection of old bridles and brushes, worn with years of use. Tucked away behind a pile of faded horse blankets, she spotted a weathered saddle wrapped in burlap. She was about to drag it out when the barn door creaked open. In stepped Tom, her father's neighbor, a quiet man in his 40s with a sunburned neck and hands roughened by decades of hard work. He'd been dropping by now and then with advice, sometimes sharing tools or stories, always careful to respect her space. "Thought I'd check in," Tom said, offering a shy smile. He looked around, taking in the chaos. "You settling in all right?" Claire hesitated, then nodded. "Mostly. It's a lot. Ash is healing, but he's been through hell." Tom walked over and peered at the saddle she'd unearthed. He touched it with a kind of reverence. "That belonged to your dad. He never trusted any other saddle with his best horses. Didn't know it was still here." The words hung in the air, thick with memory. Claire bit her lip, fighting the urge to retreat into sarcasm or silence. Instead, she tried honesty. "Did you know him well? My dad, I mean. After I left, we barely spoke." Tom took a seat on a hay bale, hands folded in his lap. "He missed you, you know. Wasn't good at saying it. When Blaze, his old stallion, was sold off, he kept that saddle as a reminder. Guess it was his way of holding on to better times." They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the rustle of horses in their stalls and the creak of the barn in the wind. Claire found herself wanting to know more, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she showed Tom the old photograph she'd found, the one of her father with a black stallion. "That's Blaze," Tom said softly. "He was legendary around here. Fast, smart, and stubborn as hell. Some folks say he had a mind of his own. Your dad loved that horse more than most people." Claire studied the photo, heart pounding. Ash's resemblance to Blaze was uncanny. The same build, the same stormy gaze. Could it really be a coincidence? Or was Ash carrying more of her family's past than she'd realized? That evening, as the sky bled pink and gold, Claire brought Ash out to the paddock. She took her time, using every gentle technique she'd learned from the vet, the internet, and Tom's patient advice. She brushed Ash's mane, whispered softly, and offered small treats for every sign of trust. A flick of his ear, a calm step forward, a sigh of contentment. The training was slow, full of setbacks, Sometimes Ash would panic at the sight of the saddle bucking or kicking at the stall door. Other times he'd freeze, muscles locked with old terror. But Claire kept going, her patience deepening with every failure. Each breakthrough felt monumental, a gentle nuzzle, a moment of eye contact, the horse letting her guide him around the paddock without flinching. Late one night, Claire sat alone in the barn, exhausted but wired. She watched Ash doze in the straw, his breath slow and steady. In the dim light, she traced her fingers over the photo of her father and Blaze. For the first time, she wondered if her dad had ever found peace, or if he'd lived with his regrets the way she did. She thought about the scars they both carried. Hers invisible, Ash's written in flesh and bone. It occurred to her that maybe, just maybe, healing wasn't about erasing those scars, but learning to live with them. Maybe that was the lesson her father had never learned. Maybe it was the lesson Ash had come to teach her. The next morning, Tom showed up with coffee and a crooked grin. He watched Claire lead Ash through some basic exercises, quietly offering tips or encouragement. Afterward, he handed her the old saddle. "Give it a try when you're ready. Sometimes the past helps us move forward, not just hold us back." Claire ran her hands over the worn leather, feeling the weight of history and possibility. She realized that, for the first time since coming home, she didn't feel alone in her struggle. There was Ash, wounded but resilient. Tom, steady and kind. Even the memory of her father, distant but lingering, felt like a presence instead of a shadow. And so, as the summer deepened and the prairie bloomed with wildflowers, Claire and Ash faced each day together. Two survivors learning, haltingly, to trust again. Their wounds would never vanish, but maybe, just maybe, they could become something else. Reminders not of pain, but of everything they'd overcome. The summer sun in Montana was relentless, its light stretching the shadows thin across the fields. Day after day, the ranch grew busier as Claire's sense of purpose took root. She had always been the type to throw herself into her work. But this was different from the adrenaline rush of conflict zones or the pressure of photo deadlines. This was slow and steady, a different kind of courage. Each morning, Claire rose before dawn, filling the barn with the aroma of fresh hay, oats, and her own bitter coffee. Ash would greet her with a low nicker, ears flicking forward, dark eyes bright with anticipation. They'd developed a rhythm: feed, water, grooming, and then training. Gentle, patient, building on trust brick by brick. Tom became a regular presence, too. Sometimes he'd bring over a sack of carrots or new bandages. Other times, just quiet company and a few jokes about her city slicker approach to ranch life. Claire found herself relying on his calm advice and steady hands, grateful for a friend who understood both the land and the stubbornness of horses. One afternoon, as Claire was brushing Ash in the golden light, Tom leaned against the paddock fence and said, "You know, there's an equine therapy event coming up in Helena next month. Survivors of trauma bring their horses, rescued or otherwise, to show what they've accomplished together. It's not about ribbons or trophies. It's about healing for the horses and their people." Claire stopped brushing, her heart quickening. "I wouldn't even know where to start. Ash isn't ready for anything like that. He's barely letting me put a saddle on him, let alone parade him around a ring." Tom shrugged, smiling. "You'd be surprised. Sometimes the hardest part isn't getting the horse ready. It's believing you deserve to be in the ring at all." That night, the idea gnawed at her. She lay awake, listening to the coyotes in the distance, imagining Ash trotting beside her in a crowd of strangers. The thought made her both anxious and exhilarated. She wondered if pushing herself and Ash toward something new might finally help them break free from the gravity of their pasts. By morning, her mind was made up. She sat at the kitchen table, opened her battered laptop, and filled out the online entry form for the Heartland Healing Equine Therapy Showcase. When she hit submit, a rush of nerves tingled through her. What if they failed? What if Ash panicked? What if she made a fool of herself in front of everyone? She nearly backed out a dozen times that first week, especially when Ash started acting up again. Training for the showcase demanded more structure, walking calmly in a circle, standing still while Claire adjusted the saddle, following her voice even when distracted by sudden noises or the presence of strangers. Ash would sometimes flare his nostrils, shying away from the unfamiliar. And once he bucked so suddenly that Claire was thrown hard into the dirt, the wind knocked out of her lungs. She lay there in the dust, staring up at the endless Montana sky, pain radiating through her ribs. Tom came running, concern etched across his face. "You all right?" he asked, helping her to her feet. Claire managed a shaky laugh. "Nothing's broken but my pride." But the fall shook her confidence. That night, she sat in the barn, tears streaming down her cheeks as she watched Ash pace in his stall, agitated by her earlier frustration. She spoke aloud to him, voice trembling. "Maybe I'm pushing you too hard. Maybe I'm pushing us both too hard." Yet something about the process, messy, painful, and imperfect as it was, felt necessary. Each setback revealed a new layer of Ash's personality, and of her own. She learned to recognize the warning signs before he bolted, to anticipate his moods, and to reward his trust with soft words and steady hands. He learned, too, how to respond to her voice, how to find safety in her presence, how to let his guard down a little more each day. The more time they spent together, the more Claire realized how much she'd been holding herself at arm's length from everyone and everything since leaving Montana. War had taught her to be wary, to protect her heart, to expect betrayal. Ash was teaching her the opposite, that vulnerability was strength, and that healing meant letting others see her scars. The weeks before the show flew by in a blur of training and chores. Tom offered steady support, never pressuring, always encouraging. He told stories about his own failed attempts in the ring, about horses who'd flat out refused to perform, about the times he'd fallen and gotten back up, about how sometimes the crowd's silence means they're holding their breath, not judging your mistakes. Claire's world slowly expanded beyond the ranch. She made a few tentative calls to local horse trainers, seeking advice. She visited the supply store where old-timers swapped tales and offered tips. Even her father's old friends started stopping by, sometimes bringing faded photos, sometimes just sharing a memory about her dad and his wild, impossible dreams. Each day brought new breakthroughs, some small and some seismic. Ash let Claire brush him without flinching, accepted the saddle without panic, and even allowed Tom to give him a gentle pat. One morning, he followed Claire around the paddock in a perfect circle, responding to her commands with nothing but a soft word and the touch of her hand. The night before the show, Claire stood in the barn, watching Ash doze in the straw. Moonlight streamed through the window, painting his coat in silver. She felt the weight of everything they'd endured, the storms, the setbacks, the days she'd nearly given up. She realized she was proud of them both, no matter what happened tomorrow. Before heading inside, she paused at the paddock fence, feeling the cool night air on her skin. Tom joined her, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. "Ready?" he asked quietly. "No," Claire admitted, with a tired smile. "But I think that's okay." Tom bumped her shoulder gently. "You and Ash have already come further than most people ever do. Just show up, that's enough." As the stars wheeled overhead and the crickets sang, Claire allowed herself a small, fragile hope. Maybe the show wasn't about proving anything to anyone else. Maybe it was just about standing in the ring, side by side with Ash, and letting the world see that two battered souls could choose to heal together. And as she closed her eyes and listened to the rhythm of Ash's breathing, she realized she wasn't alone. Not anymore. The week leading up to the Heartland Healing Equine Therapy Showcase felt like a test of everything Claire and Ash had built together. Each day was a challenge, balancing nerves, final preparations, and the ghost of failure that always seemed to linger on the edge of her thoughts. Claire woke early and worked late, checking Ash's leg for any sign of injury, running through their routine in the paddock, practicing again and again until both horse and woman were exhausted. But there was a quiet joy in it too, the sense that something important was at stake, that she and Ash were finally about to step out from the shadow of their pasts. On Thursday night, just 3 days before the show, Claire finished the evening chores with a sense of cautious optimism. Ash's wound had closed, his coat shone, and he responded to her voice like he never had before. She snapped a photo of him with her phone, planning to send it to Tom and maybe even post it online, a small celebration of their progress. As she headed toward the house, she didn't notice the strange car parked down the road, headlights off, idling in the darkness. Later that night, a noise woke Claire from a shallow sleep. It was sharp and sudden, metal against wood, the muffled shouts of voices she didn't recognize. Her heart leaped into her throat as she grabbed her flashlight and hurried out into the darkness, barefoot and shivering in her old t-shirt and jeans. The barn door hung open, swinging in the night wind. Her flashlight swept across chaos. Feed bags slashed open, tools scattered, graffiti scrawled in red across the walls. "Go home," it read in jagged, angry letters. Claire's hands shook. Fear and rage twisted inside her, cold and electric. This wasn't just random vandalism. Someone had known exactly where to strike. She found Ash trembling in his stall, nostrils flaring, sides heaving. Blood streaked one flank, a fresh cut, shallow but cruelly deliberate. Claire's heart shattered at the sight. She pressed her hands to his neck, murmuring soothing words, feeling his wild pulse through her fingertips. He was terrified, eyes rolling white, the trust they'd worked so hard to build teetering on the edge of collapse. Tom arrived within minutes, summoned by Claire's frantic phone call. He rushed into the barn, taking in the mess and the look on Claire's face. "Jesus, you okay?" he asked, gently pushing her hair out of her eyes, his own face grim with worry. Claire nodded, swallowing back tears. I don't know who did this, but it felt personal. Someone wanted to scare us off." Tom surveyed the scene, jaw clenched. "You got enemies, Claire?" She thought back over her life, her father's old disputes, her own time covering stories people didn't want told, the locals who resented newcomers. "Too many to count," she muttered. He knelt beside Ash, inspecting the new wound. "We can clean this up. Ash'll heal. But you need to be careful. Keep your doors locked. I'll check in every night." By sunrise, the barn was clean, the graffiti painted over, and Ash's wound dressed. But the damage wasn't so easily undone. Ash was jittery all morning, flinching from every sudden sound. The fragile sense of safety Claire had built for both of them had been shattered overnight. That afternoon, as she tried to coax Ash through their routine, he refused. He balked at the saddle, kicked the fence, and reared when she tried to lead him in a circle. Claire's patience snapped. She dropped the lead rope, backed away, and let the frustration pour out in a single, strangled cry. She stormed out to the edge of the property, sitting on a mossy rock beneath a cottonwood. Anger and grief warred inside her. It wasn't fair. She'd spent so long running from pain, trying to make something good out of the mess her life had become, only to have it snatched away by some faceless threat. Doubt crashed over her, heavy and relentless. Maybe the show was a mistake. Maybe she was fooling herself, thinking she could fix anything. Ash, her past, even herself. As the sky darkened, a familiar memory rose unbidden, sharp and clear. Syria, years ago. Claire huddled in a bombed-out building, camera clutched to her chest as mortars fell outside. Children screamed and adults wept. She remembered the moment she saw a little girl, dusty and bleeding, hiding beneath a broken table. Without thinking, Claire had crawled across the rubble, scooped the child into her arms, and carried her to safety. Later, a local doctor had patched the girl's wounds and, with tears in his eyes, thanked Claire for risking her life. "Sometimes," he'd said, "courage means staying when everyone else runs away." Claire sat in the fading light, breathing that memory in like oxygen. She'd been brave then. She'd stayed, even when she was terrified. She'd fought for hope, not just survival. That strength was still inside her, even if it felt buried beneath layers of fear and exhaustion. When she finally returned to the barn, the world was silent. Ash standing in the far corner of his stall, head low. Claire moved slowly, every gesture deliberate and gentle. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm scared too. But I'm not giving up. Not on you, not on us." She sat on the straw, arms wrapped around her knees, and just stayed with him. She didn't try to force him to work, didn't ask anything of him except his presence. After a long while, Ash crossed the stall, nuzzled her shoulder, and stood beside her, warm and solid in the night. The next few days were slow, but Claire let them be. She focused on small victories, a calm grooming session, a shared apple in the sunshine, Ash letting her touch his bandaged side. The big dreams of the showcase faded to the background. It was enough just to be together, to rebuild what had been shaken. Tom helped in quiet ways, repairing the barn door, installing a security camera, checking in every evening with a flask of coffee and a wry joke. "You two are tougher than you look," he said one night as the sun set over the fields. "Don't let anyone tell you different." Claire smiled, the words warming something inside her. She realized that resilience wasn't a matter of charging forward, teeth gritted and fists clenched. Sometimes it was simply refusing to back down. Sometimes it was sitting in the straw with your fears and waiting for the dawn. On the last night before the show, Claire sat by Ash's stall, writing in her journal by the light of a single bulb. She wrote about pain, about fear, about the urge to run and the harder choice to stay. She wrote about Ash, the way his trust had changed her, the way their shared wounds had started to heal. Outside, the prairie was still. For the first time since the break-in, Claire allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, tomorrow would bring a new beginning. Dawn broke quietly over the Montana prairie, painting the sky in shades of rose and pale gold. For once, the world felt calm. Claire woke in a haze of anxiety and anticipation, her mind replaying the past week's events like a fever dream. The vandalism, Ash's fear, her own moments of doubt and resolve. But the day had finally come. Today was the Heartland Healing Equine Therapy Showcase. She moved through the early morning darkness in silence, careful not to wake her father, whose health was still too fragile for the noise and bustle of show day. The house felt emptier than usual, as if holding its breath for her. Claire showered, dressed in her best faded jeans, a clean plaid shirt, and boots freshly scrubbed of dust. She stared at her reflection for a moment, older, tougher, but with eyes that now carried something softer, a flicker of hope a readiness to begin again. Out in the barn, Ash was already awake, shuffling in his stall, ears pricked forward. He seemed to sense the shift in energy, the charge of the unknown. Claire moved slowly, whispering, brushing his coat until it gleamed, checking the old wound one last time. It had healed as much as it ever would, leaving a small white scar, a badge of survival, not defeat. The trailer ride to Helena was silent, save for the hum of tires on asphalt and the occasional soft whicker from Ash behind her. Tom followed in his own truck, promising to meet her at the showgrounds with extra water, snacks, and moral support. As the city came into view, Claire's nerves spiked, her hands trembling on the wheel, her heart thudding in her chest. For a moment, she considered turning around, but the image of Ash trusting her, even after everything, kept her moving forward. The Heartland Healing Equine Therapy Showcase was nothing like the flashy competitions her father had loved. It was held at a small arena just on the outskirts of Helena, surrounded by open fields and the scent of wildflowers. The parking lot was a patchwork of battered trucks and horse trailers, families milling about, children laughing, and horses in every shape and color, from sturdy Mustangs to delicate Pintos. The atmosphere was relaxed, filled more with quiet determination than with competition. Claire found a spot at the far end of the lot and parked. She took a long breath, pressed her forehead to the steering wheel, and allowed herself a brief moment of panic. Then she climbed out and opened the trailer. Ash stepped out, head high, ears swiveling as he took in the unfamiliar sights and sounds. His body trembled, but he stood his ground, pressing his nose gently into Claire's shoulder for reassurance. Tom appeared at her side, his presence a silent anchor. "You're here," he said softly. "That's half the battle." Together, they led Ash to the warm-up area, where other participants moved through simple exercises with their horses, walking in circles, stopping and starting, some just standing quietly side by side. Claire tried to mimic their calm, steady energy, but her hands still shook as she tightened Ash's halter and whispered, "We just do this one step at a time, all right? No tricks. Just trust." When their number was called, Claire led Ash into the ring. The arena was nothing grand, just a circle of packed earth, a few rows of benches filled with families and neighbors, judges with gentle faces watching from the sidelines. But for Claire, it might as well have been Madison Square Garden. Every eye seemed to be on her, every breath echoing in the hush that fell as she entered. She took a slow breath and looked at Ash. He looked back at her, steady, uncertain, but waiting for her cue. They started with the simplest routine they'd practiced, walking in a wide, easy circle, stopping every few paces, turning, then starting again. The crowd was utterly silent, not with boredom, but with a kind of respect, a recognition of the stakes for people and horses who'd survived more than anyone could see. Claire's nerves began to melt away as she focused on Ash, on the warmth of his body beside her, the steady rhythm of his hooves on the earth. When he hesitated at the edge of the ring, she simply stopped, let him look around, and waited until he was ready to move again. She resisted the urge to hurry, to prove herself or show off. It wasn't about perfection or performance. It was about showing the world the trust they'd earned together, slow, imperfect, and real. Halfway through, Ash startled at a sudden shout from the stands, a toddler's squeal of laughter. He danced sideways, muscles tensing, but Claire gently touched his neck, murmuring soothing words. She remembered the first time she'd seen him, wild-eyed and bleeding in the storm, and how far they'd come from that night. Slowly, Ash calmed, ears flicking back to her voice, and they continued their circuit. As the minutes passed, Claire felt a shift. She was no longer aware of the crowd, or the judges, or her own nervousness. All that mattered was Ash, the way he followed her lead, the way he chose to stay with her despite everything. At the end of their routine, Claire stopped in the center of the ring, turned to Ash, and pressed her forehead gently to his. He stood perfectly still, breathing her in, a calm presence in the middle of the world's noise. A smattering of applause rippled through the stands, not loud or raucous, but heartfelt. Claire smiled, truly smiled, for the first time in weeks, a warmth blooming in her chest. As she led Ash out of the ring, Tom met her at the gate, eyes bright with pride. "You did it," he said quietly. "We did it," Claire replied, glancing at Ash, who seemed taller, prouder than she'd ever seen him. They spent the rest of the day wandering the grounds, watching other survivors show off their bonds, some with gentle tricks, some just sharing quiet moments. Claire spoke with other participants, heard stories that echoed her own. Horses rescued from neglect, riders overcoming fear or loss, the small miracles that grew from patience and kindness. She realized they were all survivors, all learning to trust again, one day at a time. That evening, as the showcase drew to a close and the sun set in a blaze of orange behind the mountains, Claire stood beside Ash and Tom, watching the last of the horses load into their trailers. She felt tired, but lighter somehow, as if she'd set down a burden she didn't even know she'd been carrying. Driving home under the vast Montana sky, Ash dozing quietly behind her and Tom humming softly in the passenger seat, Claire finally understood. Healing wasn't about erasing the scars or pretending the pain never happened. It was about showing up, standing in the ring, and letting yourself be seen, flaws, fears, and all. It was about trust, in each other and in yourself. As the ranch lights appeared in the distance, Claire reached out to rest her hand on Tom's. He squeezed her fingers gently. For the first time in years, she was excited for tomorrow. Whatever happened next, she knew she and Ash, and maybe even Tom, would face it together. Long after the applause faded and the crowd drifted away, Claire found herself lingering by the paddock fence, Ash at her side. The equine therapy showcase was officially over, but the echo of what had happened in the ring lingered with her. A quiet, stubborn warmth that resisted the evening chill. People milled around the dusty parking lot, packing trailers and laughing in small, tired groups. Tom helped load Ash's supplies into the truck, his movements calm and unhurried. For a few precious minutes, Claire let herself soak in the simple pride of what she and Ash had accomplished. There had been no awards, no dramatic headlines, just a quiet demonstration of trust, enough to shift something inside her. Ash, for his part, seemed more relaxed than Claire had ever seen him. He nudged her gently with his nose, accepting a handful of oats from her palm. His dark eyes, once haunted and sharp, were softer now, searching, present. Claire scratched behind his ears, murmuring, "You did good, buddy. You did real good." The golden light slipped away, replaced by long shadows and the silver hush of evening. She was about to call Tom to help load Ash for the drive home when a figure caught her eye. A tall, weathered man, moving slowly through the empty bleachers. He paused at the gate, hesitating, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a worn canvas jacket. Something about the man's posture was both unfamiliar and deeply familiar. He looked out of place, as if the years weighed heavy on his shoulders. His eyes, when they found Claire, held a flicker of recognition and pain. She tensed, instinctively stepping closer to Ash. Tom noticed and followed her gaze, frowning. The man raised a hand in tentative greeting. "Excuse me," he called, his voice rough with age and memory. "You wouldn't happen to be Claire Weston, would you?" Claire's guard shot up, but she nodded warily. "Yeah, that's me." He moved closer, the lines in his face catching the last of the sun. "Name's Frank McAllister. I used to ride with your dad. We did the rodeo circuit back in the day." The name stirred a distant memory. Her father, years ago, recounting wild nights on the road. Stories of broken bones and hard-won victories, always ending with, "Frank was the only one who could outdrink me, damn fool." Claire's tension softened a fraction. Frank took off his hat, twisting it in his hands. "I watched your routine out there. That horse of yours, he's something else. Reminded me a lot of Blaze." Claire's heart stuttered. "You knew Blaze?" Frank's face cracked into a sad smile. "I knew him all right. Best horse I ever saw. Except maybe for that black colt your dad was so proud of. Looks like you've got his fire." 1,000 questions raced through Claire's mind. She thought of the old photograph in the farmhouse, of Blaze's fierce eyes, of Ash's uncanny resemblance. "Frank, do you know where Blaze ended up? Or what happened to that colt?" Frank's expression shifted, a shadow passing over his features. "I do. Your dad loved that horse more than he could say. After you left, things got hard. He had to sell some stock, including Blaze's last foal. Said it was temporary, but you know how life is. Years went by and I lost track. But I heard stories. Bad ones sometimes. A black stallion passed from hand to hand. Some folks said he turned mean. But when I saw your horse out there today, I swear, Claire, he's the spitting image." Claire pressed a hand to her chest, breath shallow. "You think Ash is Blaze's foal?" Frank nodded. "I'd bet my boots on it. Your dad never could say what he was feeling, but he sent a lot of things out into the world hoping you'd find your way back. Maybe this horse was one of them." The realization struck Claire with a force she hadn't anticipated. She'd spent so long resenting her father's silence, holding tight to every hurt and slight, never guessing there might have been wordless attempts at reconciliation. Maybe the old man had tried, in the only way he knew how. Frank watched her, eyes gentle. "He was proud of you, you know. Bragged about you more than you'd ever believe. That stubborn streak, that's all him." The knot in Claire's chest unraveled, tears welling unexpectedly. "I wish he'd said it." Frank nodded, his own eyes glistening. "Men like him, sometimes they just can't. But maybe he gave you what he could." She looked at Ash, now grazing in the soft grass, and felt an overwhelming gratitude, not just for the horse, but for the strange, imperfect thread of connection her father had left behind. She let herself cry, quietly, standing beside the animal who'd carried so many scars, visible and invisible, from both their pasts. Tom joined her, arm warm across her shoulders, silent in support. Claire wiped her eyes and managed a shaky laugh. "Guess I've been angry at a ghost for a long time." "Ghosts are stubborn," Tom said, smiling gently. "But maybe they're just waiting for us to forgive them." The three stood together in the dusk, letting the peace of the evening settle around them. Frank reached out and gently stroked Ash's neck, his hands rough but kind. "You take care of him, Claire, and let him take care of you too." As the last cars rolled out of the lot, Claire finally felt the weight of years lifting. The revelation didn't erase the pain, but it made room for understanding, for forgiveness, for a future built not on anger, but on the bonds of trust she'd begun to rebuild, with Ash and maybe, in some way, with her father. Later, driving home, Claire held Tom's hand, her mind quiet for the first time in ages. Ash rode peacefully in the trailer, a living link to her family's complicated history, a history that, for once, felt like a gift. When they pulled into the ranch, stars blooming above the dark prairie, Claire turned to Tom and smiled, a real, unguarded smile. "I think I finally get it. Healing doesn't mean forgetting. It just means forgiving. Others and yourself." Tom squeezed her hand. "Welcome home, Claire." Inside the house, she hung the old photograph of her father and Blaze on the kitchen wall. A silent promise that their story, hers and Ash's, her father's, all tangled together, would not end with pain, but with hope. And that night, as she stood with Ash beneath the endless Montana sky, Claire let herself believe in second chances. The days after the showcase drifted by with a sense of calm that Claire hadn't known in years. It was as if some invisible storm had finally blown through, leaving the world washed clean. The pressure that had once coiled inside her chest, guilt, anger, longing, eased with every sunrise over the rolling Montana hills. Claire found herself lingering in moments she once would have rushed past. She'd rise with the dawn, brewing strong coffee in the quiet kitchen, watching as sunlight broke across the fields, painting everything in gold and soft shadows. Her father's house, her house, she realized now, felt warmer, more welcoming. The old walls no longer echoed with regret. There were still reminders of loss and time's relentless march. A half-fixed fence, the faint smell of her father's aftershave in the hallway. But they felt less like burdens and more like signposts on the road to healing. Most evenings, she'd walk out to the pasture as the sun dipped low, turning the world violet and blue. Ash would lift his head from grazing, his black coat shining, and trot over with an easy confidence he'd never shown in the early days. Claire would lean against the fence, sometimes talking to him, sometimes just breathing in the peace that came from being seen. By a horse, by herself, by the quiet land that had shaped her. One night, as summer faded and the stars came out sharp and cold, Claire spread a blanket in the grass beside Ash's paddock. He wandered over and stood above her, his breath steaming in the cool air, his dark eyes reflecting the distant constellations. Claire let herself rest her head against his warm shoulder, listening to the slow, steady sound of his breathing. Her thoughts drifted to everything that had happened. The storms, the violence, the stubborn will to heal. She remembered how, as a child, she'd believed pain was something you could outrun or outwork, that growing up meant growing tougher, harder. But that had never brought peace, only more distance. She'd spent so long resenting her father's silence, only to discover that silence was its own language, a way of carrying pain forward, generation after generation, until someone was brave enough to stop running. With Ash, she saw the cost of that silence written in scars and in the hesitance of his trust. She also saw what was possible when someone stayed, when someone showed up every day with patience and care. The slow work of feeding, grooming, healing, these were acts of faith, tiny gestures that built a bridge across the gulf of old wounds. Ash had been her mirror, wounded, wary, quick to flee but longing for connection. They'd both spent years surviving, not living. Claire turned these thoughts over and over, letting them settle into her bones. She realized the past would never be tidy. Her father's failings, her own mistakes, the cruelty Ash had endured. None of it could be erased. But none of it had to define the future either. Healing, she understood now, wasn't about forgetting or pretending the pain had never happened. It was about learning to live honestly with the ache, to let the light in around the edges, to find meaning in the spaces where pain and hope overlapped. She opened her journal and began to write, words spilling out easier than they had in years. She wrote about Ash, about the way his trust had changed her, about how she'd learned to see her own life with kinder eyes. She wrote about her father, about the grudges she'd clung to, about forgiveness that was messy and imperfect, but real. She wrote about the lesson that kept repeating itself. True transformation didn't come in a single moment of triumph. It came in the accumulation of small choices, a hand extended, a gentle word, the courage to keep trying. Ash stood quietly as she read her thoughts aloud, the two of them illuminated by starlight and memory. "I think you saved me as much as I saved you," she whispered, smiling at his soft snort. There were still hard days. Sometimes Ash startled at a shadow, or Claire woke from restless dreams. Sometimes old habits of self-doubt returned, whispering that she wasn't strong enough, that she hadn't done enough to deserve happiness. But now, when those thoughts came, Claire knew how to answer them. She remembered the way Ash had looked at her in the storm, the way he'd chosen, again and again, to trust her despite everything. That was enough. One afternoon, Tom stopped by with groceries and news from the neighbors. They sat on the porch together, sipping iced tea, watching Ash graze in the paddock. After a while, Tom spoke quietly. "You know, I think your dad would be proud, not just of what you did for Ash, but of who you've become." Claire took his hand, grateful for his steady presence. Maybe. Or maybe I just finally let myself be proud too. They talked about plans for the future. Maybe opening the ranch for equine therapy sessions. Maybe writing an essay about what Ash had taught her. Maybe just letting things unfold one day at a time. The pressure to prove herself was gone. What mattered was the life she was building, the peace she was making with her past and her present. That night, as she sat beside Ash under the canopy of stars, Claire let her mind drift. She thought of all the people carrying invisible wounds, neighbors, strangers, children she'd photographed on war-torn streets. She wished she could tell them, "You don't have to do it alone. Healing is slow, but it's possible. Sometimes it starts with a single gesture of empathy, a look, a touch, a second chance." Ash shifted beside her, his body solid and warm against the chill. Claire rested her hand on his mane, breathing in the scent of grass and horse and summer's last warmth. She closed her eyes and let gratitude settle deep in her chest. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be days when trust frayed, when pain felt raw again. But now, Claire knew she could face them. Not with armor, but with honesty. Not with anger, but with love. As the first hints of dawn pinked the horizon, she whispered into the quiet, "Thank you, Ash, for everything." And beneath the endless sky, with the prairie stretching out in every direction, Claire finally felt whole. A survivor, yes, but also a healer, a friend, and above all, someone unafraid to start again. Months slipped by, soft and sure as sunrise over the Montana prairie. Autumn painted the ranch in russet and gold, and mornings arrived with a faint chill, the grass glistening beneath a thin veil of frost. Claire woke each day with a quiet sense of purpose, her routine now as natural as breathing. Coffee at the kitchen table, boots by the door, the satisfying rhythm of chores carried out beneath a sky that seemed to stretch forever. Life with Ash settled into something steady, almost ordinary, except nothing about it ever truly felt mundane. The black horse had become more than a companion. He was a living reminder of how far both had come, and a symbol of all the healing yet possible. The white scar on his flank faded but never disappeared, a badge of endurance rather than defeat. And with each passing day, Ash's confidence grew, his trust deepening, his joy visible in every playful buck or gentle nuzzle. Inspired by their journey, Claire wanted to share what she and Ash had found. One bright afternoon, she walked down to the local equine therapy center, Ash's lead rope loose in her hands. The center sat at the edge of town, a humble stable surrounded by open fields, laughter, and the easy sound of children's voices. The director, a sturdy woman named Maria, greeted Claire warmly, her eyes lighting up as Ash approached. "We've heard about you two," Maria said, running a gentle hand down Ash's neck. "The folks from the showcase still talk about what you did in the ring. I was hoping you'd come by." Claire smiled, her nerves dissolving in the sunlight. "I'd love for Ash to help. He's ready. And I think I am too." So they began volunteering together. At first, Ash was wary. Unfamiliar faces, small hands reaching, the bright laughter of children with disabilities who rode in special saddles. But as always, Claire stayed by his side, soothing and guiding, letting Ash learn at his own pace. Slowly, almost magically, the horse who had once flinched from every touch now stood calm and patient as children clung to his mane, whispered secrets into his ear, or simply leaned against his warm side. There were moments that caught Claire by surprise. A young boy with Down syndrome resting his cheek against Ash's shoulder. A nonverbal girl bursting into delighted giggles as Ash followed her around the paddock. Each encounter became its own small miracle, a testament to what could happen when two wounded beings chose to trust, to give, and to receive. Claire captured these moments with her camera, her old skills awakening with fresh meaning. She filled memory cards with images of hope, Ash trotting gently beside a child's wheelchair, Claire helping a nervous parent settle their son in the saddle, sunlight streaming through the barn onto scenes of laughter and connection. The photos weren't for headlines or acclaim. They were offerings, windows into a world where healing was real and ongoing. With encouragement from Tom and Maria, Claire crafted a photo essay, "What Ash Taught Me." The project blended her journal entries with images of Ash's journey, the therapy center, and the lessons she'd learned about patience, forgiveness, and the strength found in vulnerability. She wrote not just about their survival, but about the deeper work of recovery, how each person, like each horse, carried unseen wounds and needed compassion above all. The essay found its way online, shared quietly at first, then spreading wider than Claire had dared hope. Emails trickled in, messages from veterans, from parents, from strangers who saw themselves in Claire's words or Ash's gentle eyes. People thanked her for the honesty, for the hope, for reminding them that starting over was possible, even when it seemed impossible. The ranch itself felt transformed. Children and parents came and went, their laughter drifting through open windows. Tom became a fixture, helping fix fences, teaching new volunteers, and finding ever more creative ways to spoil Ash with treats and attention. Claire's father, frailer now but content, sometimes sat on the porch, watching the world with a small, proud smile. One late afternoon, Claire stood by the fence, watching Ash and a group of children race through the grass. The horse galloped, mane flying, his joy infectious. Maria joined her, leaning on the rail. "He's a different animal than when you brought him here," Maria said quietly. Claire nodded, her eyes shining. "He taught me how to be different too." Maria smiled, and for a long moment, they stood in companionable silence, the prairie golden around them. As winter approached, Claire continued to write, to photograph, and to share her story. Each act felt like an invitation, a way to say, "You're not alone. Healing is possible. Don't give up." On the anniversary of her return, Claire hosted a small gathering at the ranch. Friends, children, families, and horses came together, sharing food and stories beneath strings of lanterns. Tom offered a toast, his voice steady with emotion. To Claire and Ash. Proof that healing comes, not all at once, but with every brave step forward. When the last guest left and the stars shone bright above the quiet prairie, Claire walked to the fence and whistled softly. Ash trotted over, stopping beside her. She stroked his nose, her heart full to overflowing. "Thank you, old friend," she whispered, "for teaching me to stay, for showing me that scars can become something beautiful." In that peaceful silence, with Ash by her side and the ranch sleeping behind her, Claire understood the story's true lesson. Healing is not a destination, but a journey, one shaped by kindness, courage, and the willingness to begin again. As dawn crept over the mountains, Claire watched Ash gallop across the field, his silhouette bold against the new light. She smiled, a quiet promise to herself and to anyone who might be listening. If this story touched your heart, consider sharing it. Someone out there might need a story of healing to believe again.